Hello and welcome to the video. Today I want to talk about what I think is the #1 mistake that most poker players make. To do that, I'm going to swap over to GTO Wizard and I'm going to step you through a hand I played at a recent live event, and I'm going to just talk about the different ways that you could think about this spot on the river and where I think it highlights a mistake a lot of people make. So my opponent raises from the hijack to 2.3 big blinds. I'm on the button. We're about 100 bigs deep. It's a tournament, but it's early stages, so there's not necessarily any ICM. I free bet, and my opponent decides to call. We get the flop of ace of clubs, six of diamonds, five of spades. Ace-6, 5 rainbow. My opponent checks, I go for a half pot bet, and my opponent calls. The turn is a jack, which starts a flush draw, jack of diamonds. And on the turn it goes check, check. The river is now the jack of hearts. And you can see from a solver's point of view, it makes sense to check with your entire range on this river. That's essentially because when I bet the flop and don't bet the turn, I'm really condensed to having a jack because it's very medium strength. It doesn't want to bluff. It can win at showdown, whereas my ace-x wants to barrel a lot. My bluffs want to barrel a lot. So the jack is actually a really good card for me. It's kind of hard for my opponent to have a jack as well. So in theory, my opponent checks range. But that's not what happened in game. My opponent bet just over half pot, 4.6 thousand into about 8,000, and I went all in for about 17,000. So somewhere around 4 times the bet. And my opponent folded ace queen. It's not necessarily about, is this a good fold, is this a bad fold? It's more about how do you come to the decision of whether you should call ace queen on this river. The first way of thinking about this spot is my opponent is never bluffing here. They just don't have any bluffs that will free bet pre, bet the flop, check back the turn, and then go all in on the river, which are worse than ace queen, therefore I fold every single time I have ace queen. That's one way to think about it. Way two is more of a game theory approach, and that is, where am I in my range? And if you know that when you bet the river, you would bet with ace-9, you would bet with ace-10, you would bet with ace-queen, and maybe you don't have ace-king very often, and maybe you raise the flop when you have pocket sixes, pocket fives sometimes, and you have ace-jack sometimes, but ace-queen's quite high up in your betting range. You might just draw the line somewhere and decide, okay, ace-queen is above that threshold, therefore I call. Another way to think about it is, when I have a good blocker to my opponent's value, that's the times I'll call, and that's how I won't call every time, and I'll balance my frequencies. You can look at your ace-queen and decide, if we go back to the board, you can see that the two jacks are the jack of diamonds and the jack of hearts. So what's a common way for me to have a jack here? Well, I free bet pre, so I don't have as many offsuit hands. What's a hand that might play this way? Queen, jack of clubs, queen, jack of spades. King, jack of clubs, king, jack of spades. These are hands that make sense, all the jack 10 of those. So you could say to yourself, okay, if I have ace queen and I block one of those value hands, so if I have the queen of spades or the queen of clubs, it blocks my opponent's queen jack suited, whereas if I have the queen of diamonds, it doesn't, assuming that my opponent only free bets with the suited hands. That's another way of looking at it, because it's a way of condensing your call range. It makes the hands you're calling with definitely stronger. If you value bet the river with ace-10 of spades, for example, that could be the one you call, but if you value bet the river with ace-10 of diamonds, that could be the one you fold. And then you could call with some ace-10 and some ace-queen, and this is a very game theory way to look at it, because it's saying, okay, I don't know what my opponent's doing. I'm just going to control my frequencies by calling with the blockers sometimes. But in reality, although this is an upgraded way of thinking, it's still not the best end product, and I'm going to explain why. Problem I think most people have is this rigid way of thinking. It's either my opponent is always bluffing, therefore I always call, or it's my opponent is never bluffing, therefore I always fold, or it's I'm just going to do game theory and I'm not going to be exploited because I'm going to control my frequencies in this way, and it doesn't matter what my opponent's doing. These are all very rigid ways of thinking, and in practice, we need an amalgamation of all of these things. So I'm going to AI solve this spot now. And for starters, I'm going to play around with the range a little bit, and I'm just going to step through from my point of view how I think my opponent plays and see where the exploits come in. This is supposed to be the hijack's range. I'm going to see where I agree and disagree. So if I never think they fall bet pocket tens, then they always have pocket tens. If I never think they fall bet pocket jacks, they always have pocket jacks. I'd say they always have jack 10 suited, queen 10 suited, king 10 suited, sure. They always have king queen suited. I don't think people four bet hands like king queen off enough, but maybe they fold them sometimes. So I think having that discounted does make some sense. I don't think people call enough with these suited kings, so I'm going to get rid of the king 6, 7, and king 8 suited. King 9 suited, sure, I'll give it sometimes. 10 9 suited, let's say they always call with this hand. And like these frequencies can be lower. Maybe they fold ace jack, maybe they four bet sometimes, sure. This is step one. I've changed my opponent's range a little bit, which is also going to change the solver output and how both players should play. Solver's given me a 140% bet size. I'm going to change that to what happened in game because I bet 50% of the pot instead. And already at this point in game, I think there's some differences in how people play. So I'm gonna play around with this a little bit. And I'm gonna say, I don't think my opponent ever raises the flop with ace queen, ace jack, ace 10, ace 9, ace 4. I think they pure fold with pocket 4s and pocket 3s because it's still a bigger bet. I think they fold pocket 2s. I don't think they ever raise the ace jack and ace queen. Ace king, sure, sometimes they're going to raise that one. Feels all right. I don't think they're ever going to raise pocket 8s or pocket 7s, so I'm just going to make these pure call. 6s and 5s, yeah, they're going to raise these sometimes. I'll leave that as it is. 8 7, sure. Pocket 9s, that's probably not going to fold. Let's make them pure call 9s and 10s once. And I don't think they're going to raise 6 7 suited either, to be honest. Let's make them call 5 4 suited. Let's make it as typical as we can. I'm going to lock that strategy in and I'm going to node lock. So it's going to readjust the strategy and tell me what should really be happening now. Already you can see that my bet has gone to close to a range bet based on my opponent overfolding and not raising enough. So we bet half pot and my opponent calls. And now the turn is a jack of diamonds, starts a flush draw. You're going to see a lot of leads now, I expect. Yep. So the solver has realized its range has got stronger than it was necessarily supposed to, and it started leading. I don't think my opponent's ever going to lead this card, so I'm just going to delete this from the equation. And now this is the way I'm supposed to barrel. I'm already supposed to be pretty scared with ace king now that their range has become so much more condensed. So my betting range is now super defensive on the turn. So I check, river's a jack, and still, even though we played around with it, it's going to be a range check on the river. This is the part that's really important in this hand. My opponent did bet, so I don't think he's going to go all in. The bet size he chose was around about 55% pot. So I'm going to force this to be the only bet size allowed. And I'm just going to give them the strategy that I think it is. And in practice, I think they're just betting ace queen, they're betting ace king. Let's say that they bet half the time with ace jack, because maybe they go for the check raise. Sometimes it's pretty locked up. And let's say they bet most of the time with their pocket fives, pocket sixes. They always bet ace 10. And let's say that they bet sometimes with ace 9 and ace 8. And let's say they bet sometimes with like all these other ace X. There's a little value bet. Why not? In fact, let's lower these frequencies down to like 25% for the base is worse than ace 8. Something like this is more what I would expect on the river. Also, people not wanting to just check give up with like these no showdown hands for sure. Let's give these two. Maybe they don't bluff with pairs. Maybe they always bluff if they've got king high. Something like this might be more what I expect in game. Again, this is all just my assumptions. I could be completely wrong here. This is just how I would expect intuitively my opponent to play this spot. So now I'm forcing them to bet this range, and this is how I'm actually supposed to play on the river. And you can see that now, so this strategy is now Fantasyland, because my opponent was supposed to check their range on the river, but we've given them a betting range. We can go a step further beyond that and say, okay, when my opponent bets the river, they are going to use this ranking equation, and they're only going to call the river the times that they have ace queen with the blocker, because that's how they set their frequencies. They want the 10 or the queen of the suit that interacts with my jacks. And so they always fold these ones, and then obviously they call ace jack, they call their boats. But then for the ace queen suits, let's say that they only call the specific suits that we spoke about. Let's say they always call ace king because maybe they chop with value sometimes. And now just if you look here on the right, I've got this table. I'm going to make them fold the ace queen of hearts, fold the ace queen of diamonds, call ace queen of spades. I'm going to make them fold the ace 10 of hearts and ace 10 of diamonds, but always call with ace queen of spades and ace 10 of spades. And I'll go into the offsuit combos. Anytime they have the queen of clubs or the queen of spades, I'm going to get them to call these ones. And anytime that they have the queen of diamonds or the queen of hearts, I'm going to get them to fold, as you can see here. So now this is just the ace queens with the blockers that we're getting to call the river, and obviously all the boats calls. If in game, my thought as the button on the river was this is my opponent's strategy, because that's how they set their frequencies. We can then see the difference of in my strategy as the button. And if you go back to my all-in range here, I'm bluffing the deck. I'm literally saying this player is folding way, way, way too much. I'm bluffing pretty much with everything. Every king 7, every king 8, every king 9. I'm just going absolutely ham because I know my opponent is overfolding because this is the hands that they're betting and this is the way they're responding to it. So you can see, look at the EV of king 7 suited here. King 7, by going all in on the river, if my assumptions are correct here, is making about 12 big blinds by going all in. Whereas before we changed it, king 7 was a pure fold on the river. It would have been a losing bluff. If we just make these few assumptions, if we stop our thought process being so rigid of we need to play in this exact box, this is the amount of EV we can generate. I hope this hits home that whenever you're in game, all of these little clues are always there. And you can always give weightings to your assumptions too, because maybe you think my opponent over bluffs, but I don't know how. So I'm not going to go too crazy because I'm 90% sure that they're going to fold everything, but then the other 5% of the time they call with just this range and 5% of the time they call with everything. You can weight your assumptions and use that to drive the strategy. Now, imagine you flip the spot on its head completely. You're a pure GTO player for how you play the button. You're never going to consider bluffing with most of these hands because you'll be very exploitable. But that's not the world we live in. We live in a world where people bet the river with ace queen, and either they call every time, or they fold every time, or they set their frequencies based on the blockers. And the ranges are so different to the theory that everything kind of goes out the window. And a lot of these bluffs that are prints, some people are never taking. Obviously, it's circular, where if your opponent then thinks you're over bluffing, they should bet and never fold the river, and it's always a leveling war. But if you're one step ahead on the leveling war, look at the amount of EV you make with all these different parts of your range that usually don't make any EV. So that's the main point I wanted to make, that if you stay with the rigid thought process of I need to be GTO or I think my opponent's in the same box as me, I never bluff this spot, therefore they never bluff this spot, we are either going to be completely run over or we're going to miss out on all of this EV that we could be exploiting our opponent for. And we can see the next step to this. If I lock in the opponent's strategy here, which is going completely crazy, and then we unlock the response. So we go into the hijack strategy against this, and I say unlock, it's now going to recalibrate as if it knows that we're going crazy. As the out of position player, you never ever fold with top pair. And in fact, on top of that, you never ever fold with king high. So anytime you've got a smidge of showdown on the river, you would bet as kind of an induce and you would always call the raise. But that's the thing with poker, it's this constant push-pull of I don't necessarily know that my opponent's going crazy here. And maybe based on my past experience, I've never seen people go crazy here, so I'm going to massively divert and go the other way. It's almost like the GTO response is the safe spot to be where your opponent can't exploit you. And it's like a defense to the fact you don't understand how your opponent's playing. But if you stick with that rigid thought process, you're never going to get all this extra EV. The main point is just be more fluid. Think, what is my opponent actually doing? Are they capable of bluffing here? How confident am I with my own assumptions here? And why am I that confident? Have I been in these spots in the past before? Is it that I've never seen this opponent bluff and I've got a big sample? Or is it a completely unknown player, so I've got these population reads? All of this should be in your thought process in game. I'm not saying that ace queen folding is going to be a mistake here. I'm saying that if you always fold ace queen no matter what, it's definitely a mistake. And if you only ever call using the blockers, it could also be a mistake. And it really just depends on your opponent. And it's constantly about what's my read on my opponent? How can I be that one level ahead? Do I think they're over bluffing or not? And how do I balance that with my assumptions? Obviously, in this case, it is fantasy land, so it's a lot more important that you are purely going off your opponent's strategy. Whereas other spots, like if my opponent did have a betting range on the river, it would have made more sense for me to understand how to respond to it rather than a spot where it doesn't make sense for them to bet and then I have to completely go based on assumptions. That's the biggest mistake. It's just being too rigid with your thought process. It's deciding that people are always capable of bluffing or that they're never capable of bluffing and not necessarily paying enough attention to prior hands and using this information. It's just deciding I've got the one size fits all strategy no matter what, which could be GTO or it could be kind of playing against yourself. Poker's about constantly adapting. Run some node lock spots, look at some exploits, and you'll see that the strategy can shift completely on its head if you just change a few different factors about your strategy. Okay, that's all for this video. I hope that highlights a mistake that you might be making yourself, or if not, something you might be able to exploit in other people that do have this rigid mindset if you can get one step ahead of them. Okay, that's all. Be more fluid with your mindset or exploit people who are being too rigid. Thanks for watching.